Hi, ladies. Thanks to everyone who's able to make it live here. And of course, this will be recorded for anyone who can't make it live. But today we're going to be talking about sleep, especially sleep changes in midlife, why your sleep is getting worse and worse and worse as you get into your 40s, 50s, and potentially beyond. Why some of the things that you've tried maybe haven't worked for you, and what is the root cause of it, so we can actually help to get you sleeping better as a female in that midlife transition. Sleep is everything. I definitely know that myself, being a female in midlife. When I don't sleep, really nothing else in life works that well. I work with many women that have 2, 3, 4 hours of sleep a night on average, and they're still going. They're still getting up for their job every day. They're still showing up for other people, their family, etc., their extended family, the things that they are obligated to do. And they're not functioning well. And there's obviously a huge reason for that when you're not getting that sleep. So let's talk about why you could not be sleeping well. In case you didn't notice from the looks of the first page here, I have some ideas around why, because I've seen it with myself and I've seen it with so many of the women that I work with, why sleep is not at its best for a female over 40. So one of the biggest root causes, we think it's hormones. We think it's our sex hormones. And yes, our sex hormone levels are lowering as females in the perimenopause, menopause transition, no doubt. Estrogen and progesterone are on the decline. But they, surprisingly, for most women, especially when I run labs, because I often run labs when I work with women, women that have disrupted sleep, amongst many other concerns, health wise, and other symptoms. And 9 times out of 10, if not 10 times out of 10, we see the root cause of the sleep imbalances coming from the adrenals and the imbalances with cortisol, not actually from the imbalances in the sex hormone levels themselves or the lowering of those hormones. So let's chat about it. Here's just a little graph about how cortisol actually works throughout the day. So when we wake up, we should have a certain amount of cortisol in our system, which helps us wake up. Cortisol rises throughout the morning until about early afternoon, and then it should start to gradually fall to get us ready for sleep. So it works on a little bit of what I would call a bell curve as far as balanced cortisol for us as females. Now, many of us do not have that happening. So we're going to talk about why and what you can do about it. So for those of you that don't know me, I am a functional medicine practitioner. I am certified and I'm a healthcare professional. I've been working in the field of women's health for almost 25 years now. And I want to talk about root cause perspectives, not just in regards to sleep, but hormone symptoms and potentially other health symptoms that you're experiencing as a midlife female. So when we work functionally, we look at what's called a functional medicine matrix. And we look to understand way upstream where the symptoms are coming from. We don't look downstream at the problem and just how to manage the problem. We look upstream as to why you have the problem in the first place. So we can really heal the body from a root cause perspective. So when we're out of balance with sleep, as the title suggested, cortisol and imbalances with the adrenals is one of the primary root causes. And so within the functional medicine matrix, that would actually fall under the category of communication, which has to do with our hormonal endocrine system, our HPA axis, and also our energy systems. So those two areas would be an area that we would put sleep under as far as some of the nodes of areas of impact. The other thing with sleep, what happens, which I will talk about a bit more here as we go, but as we start to gradually have more and more dysfunction with our sleep and less hours, less and less quality of sleep, we don't get resets in some of these other big systems in the body. Our immune system, which is defense and repair, will not reset in the night if we don't get at least 7 hours of sleep every night. Now, many women are not getting 7 hours of sleep. And that's 7 hours with at least 2 of those hours being high quality deep sleep. So some women actually do sleep 7 hours, but they don't actually get the quality for their sleep. So it's still not allowing that immune system and that inflammatory system to reset in the night. Sleep can also fall under the digestive category. Why is that? Which is assimilation. Because if we're not digesting properly, sometimes that can be something as simple as eating too late at night when our metabolism and our digestion is slowing down. But often it's more than that. There can be many different reasons why women have imbalances with their digestion. Actually, even the lowering of the sex hormones, estrogen in particular, can slow down the motility in the gut. So it can start to impact digestion. So if we're not digesting well and we actually have food in our stomachs as we go to sleep, that will impact our ability to get into sleep, especially good quality deep sleep. So you can see on this functional medicine matrix, and just looking at the cycle of all the different areas that can actually be impacting our ability to get to sleep and stay asleep. So it's not just about hormones. There can be other things. Biotransformation and elimination is about how our body is detoxifying throughout the day. Now, there's many different reasons why we could have buildup of different toxin loads in our body. I do lab tests to help us understand this, but there's often lots of clues when I work with women one-on-one in their history and what they tell me. For example, most women in their 40s, 50s, and beyond, if you ever had cavities and fillings when you were a child, they were amalgam fillings. So many people actually have had slow leaching of heavy metals, mercury in particular, and that's a toxin load in the body. And those toxin loads settle into our fatty tissue and our fatty organ system, and they can impact inflammation, and they can also impact our ability to have good quality sleep. So you can see how everything is interrelated, and we really have to dig down and understand the root causes as to why you potentially are having crummy sleep at this point. It's certainly not just about hormones. So what are cortisol's primary functions? So it is our main stress response hormone in the body. It's the most powerful one. Manages and regulates our stress response. So it is responsible for managing both our short-term acute stress as well as long-term stress management. So it's that running away from the bear in that acute stress situation. And then there's the management of everyday life, especially in our modern day world, and all the stressors that come at us day after day after day at a low grade, maybe sometimes higher than others. But that's our more long-term stress management strategy. So we should be producing cortisol to respond to that. So cortisol responds to stress, and it also works to regulate our sleep-wake cycles. So you saw that graph on the first page that I showed you about how cortisol rises and falls on a bell curve. That's if everything is in balance with cortisol. Now, it also, again, of course, helps to buffer our stress. So when we have a stressful response in our bodies, then what happens when we have that stress response is our body produces cortisol to help keep that stress response balanced and regulated. So really, really important to have cortisol balanced and functioning well to help us with that stress resiliency and stress response, both for short and long-term stress management. And then cortisol also works to control and manage inflammation levels, including blood sugars. And also this can be something that really comes up for women as they get into midlife in their 40s and beyond, because blood sugars naturally actually become a little bit more unbalanced. They start to rise a little bit as our estrogen levels fall. There's actually this kind of so if this is cortisol and blood sugar and this is estrogen, they're kind of working against each other, unfortunately for us as females, as we hit midlife. So if we have imbalances with our cortisol and our blood sugars, both can significantly impact sleep. Now, many of you may not understand this or even know that this is a thing, but there are different types of cortisol. So just to keep it simple, there's free cortisol, and that's our body's primary response to stress. So we have a stressor, we produce cortisol to respond to that. But we also have something called metabolized cortisol. And this is the cortisol that actually keeps our battery charged. It keeps us going throughout the day. We can only utilize as much cortisol as we're able to metabolize. So even if we're producing a ton of cortisol, again, imagine you're running away from a bear or an enemy or that kind of thing, and your body's producing a ton of cortisol. If you're not able to metabolize it, and I don't know if any of you have experienced that with a big rush of adrenaline from a really stressful event, but you're just absolutely exhausted after that event. And that's very common when adrenaline goes up and you're not metabolizing that cortisol well. People will crash after. So you want to make sure that not only with cortisol that you have balanced cortisol production, but we also want to make sure that you're actually able to use that cortisol for energy. And that metabolized cortisol, when it's balanced throughout the day, it also actually helps you to sleep well at night. And then there's also something called cortisone, and this is an inactive form of cortisol. And this pathway, cortisone will be activated when we are under chronic stress. So there's ways for us to test for this. This is a Dutch test, so it actually shows the different pathways with cortisol, and it shows your metabolized cortisol, not just free. So it's really important for us to understand, not only are you producing enough cortisol, but are you utilizing it properly throughout the day? Are you producing too much, not enough? All of these things are clues for us to understand potentially why you may not be sleeping well in midlife. So what are the primary reasons we could have high cortisol? If we're under stress, if we're under a lot of stress all the time, if we have stressful life events, that will elevate our cortisol. It can become a real cycle, because if we're not sleeping properly or for long enough, we don't get reset in our systems overnight, we will start to end up in a state of higher cortisol as well. So when we sleep properly at night, our cortisol resets in the night, to keep us balanced for the amount of cortisol production we need the next day. This can be a big problem for shift workers, people that are working at night, because they stay in a higher state of cortisol at night when they should actually be lower for sleep. But you don't have to be a shift worker to not be sleeping properly or long enough to have high cortisol, that's for sure. And if we have high inflammation levels, that'll also push cortisol up. So again, a lot of people just assume that because it's midlife and the hormone levels are shifting and changing, that it's the low hormones that are causing the poor sleep. Especially some women sleep more poorly if you're still cycling right leading up to your period. So then they assume that it's tied 100% into your hormones. But often inflammation, if it's too high, if it's out of balance, there can be various different reasons for that. That actually will elevate our cortisol as well. So some women have chronic conditions, they have autoimmunity. You may or may not even know if you have an autoimmune condition. Many women eat on the go, they eat more packaged processed foods. I mean, our environment is just full of that. So a lot of women actually have high inflammation just from our lifestyle strategies, unfortunately, in the world that we live in. So elevated cortisol can be due to lifestyle for sure. Also, if we are overweight, we won't sleep well. And again, you can see how this can become a real cycle, because if you're not sleeping well for long enough, it will also not allow your metabolism to reset in the night. So you will start to gain weight. But again, on the other side of it, if you are not managing your weight well, it will cause insulin levels to rise and blood sugars. And again, that inflammation will not allow us to have proper sleep, because we've got elevated cortisol from that extra weight. Another reason for high cortisol is overtraining. So I see this a lot with athletic women in this age category, especially women that are maybe concerned about their weight. They're overtraining. They're doing high intensity workouts. They're not allowing themselves to recover long enough. They're doing long distances, challenging type things. And it's harder on the body, actually, as you get into your 40s and our hormone levels start to shift. And that can really start to elevate cortisol. Another thing that often women don't understand is a relationship with other hormones, not just our sex hormones, and that's thyroid. So when the thyroid gland is over or under functioning, that also can elevate cortisol. And you can see, obviously, there's some symptoms here of high cortisol. There's more, but high cortisol, especially prolonged high cortisol, can start to elevate our blood pressure, can change actually our face. We tend to become more flush, more puffy, weight gain around the midline, super common with high cortisol. Some people call it cortisol belly. More rapid mood swings when we have high cortisol. Our nervous system is on high alert more often, and that can also lead to increased anxiety. It actually also can increase risk of bone fractures and osteoporosis, because when we're high in cortisol, we're more inflamed, and it doesn't allow us to absorb our nutrients as well, those key nutrients that we need for our bone health. So there's huge impacts from having high cortisol. Not just the poor sleep, but some of these other things that go along with it. Now, we can also actually have surprisingly low cortisol. So there are females that are not sleeping well. And the reason they're not sleeping well is because their cortisol is too low. So you don't want it too high. You don't want it too low. You want it on that nice bell curve throughout the day and low in the sleep, but you don't want it low throughout the day. And some women have it low throughout the day. This typically happens when there has been a really prolonged response to stress. So chronic low-grade stress, the most common reason for low cortisol levels. And again, why do women get there? Often what happens is the cortisol goes too high initially, and then basically the body is not able to continue with that high production capacity, and so it starts to lower. Some women, they actually report feeling, they almost have like what's called a cortisol crash, like they just flatline and they are burnt out, exhausted. They can barely get out of bed, get the tasks done of everyday life, let alone work and all the other things. So it's actually really common to have insomnia, fatigue, exhaustion. And, you may think all of the fatigue and exhaustion is tied into poor sleep, but it can be also tied into low cortisol. Many women have mood shifts. They have intense irritability. They're dependent on caffeine. They can't get out of bed and get anything done unless they have that caffeine. And then that leads to an afternoon crash. Blood sugars go up and down with that. So low cortisol obviously is not what we're looking for either for optimal sleep. And back to the thyroid, you can be either over or under function with your thyroid and have this low cortisol. This used to be termed adrenal fatigue. It's not usually termed that way anymore, but it's definitely the adrenals are on low function when you have low cortisol. So what is the number one symptom of cortisol imbalance, which is why we're talking about this with sleep? Poor sleep. It's the number one issue that shows up. So chicken or egg, which one came first? Most typically, it's the cortisol that gets out of balance that disrupts the sleep. So, and again, the poor sleep can happen whether the cortisol is too high or too low. Either extreme is not good. So we need that balance. And we need to get you back into that 7 to 9 hour sleep cycle. Easier said than done, but it's for us to understand where the root of it could be coming from. Now, of course, many people with cortisol imbalances have a lot of fatigue. They often have mood changes. And like I said, they often have weight changes as well. We're focusing primarily on the sleep. Many of you told me that sleep was one of your number one concerns as far as what's impacting your quality of life as you get into midlife. Okay, so how do cortisol imbalances impact your hormones? So we actually know for you as a female over 40 or 50 that your sex hormone levels are lowering, and they're actually lowering at an uneven rate. Progesterone's lowering more quickly than estrogen, so there's a built-in imbalance there. But what happens when your cortisol is out of balance along with that, which it is for many, many women, especially women that aren't sleeping well. And a lot of it has to do with our fast-paced world, tasks that we're required to do. Sometimes we're over-functioning when we don't really need to be. I see this a lot with, quote unquote, type A women, perfectionists, personalities. They feel like they have to be holding up all the balls in the air all at once, all the time. They never give themselves a break. It's go, go, go. So over time, of course, if you have ongoing cortisol production due to that high requirement for output, what can happen is once the adrenal gland basically runs out of gas and you're still asking for more production, is the body's smart. It learns how to compensate. So it will start to utilize other hormones to make cortisol because it thinks it needs to do that to survive. So you can see some of the pathways here where cortisol basically utilizes other hormones like pregnenolone, DHEA, progesterone, even estrogen, testosterone. So what can happen in perimenopause and menopause is those hormone levels are already declining. So they can either decline more quickly or they can decline in more imbalance as we move into this stage of life. So not only are you left with poor sleep, you're left with other symptoms. Often women that aren't sleeping well in midlife also have other hormone imbalance symptoms in the transition into menopause. Super common to have hot flashes, flushing, if you have cortisol imbalances as the sex hormone levels lower. That'll be amplified if the hormones are lowering more quickly because of this extreme cortisol imbalance. Many women, if you are still cycling, you will have poor cycles. Often women have a heavier bleeding. Cortisol, if it's high, inflammation's higher, so that often results in heavier bleeding. Sometimes it actually results in more quick repeat cycles, so every 2.5, 3 weeks versus every 3.5, 4 weeks, which is very depleting for many women, most women. And then low libido, low drive, low motivation. I know many women said this too. It's not just the poor sleep. They just have no drive, no motivation, no libido. They just don't feel like themselves anymore. So this is super, super common because of that extreme depletion of not only what you think is your sex hormones declining, but the cortisol actually can contribute to those sex hormone levels declining more quickly and in a more imbalanced way. Not too much fun, is it? And then what can happen too is if we have these imbalances for long enough, cortisol and the adrenal gland have very direct communication with the thyroid. And it's not uncommon when you see extreme imbalances with the adrenals, either with really high or really low cortisol, that starts to also impact thyroid function. So very, very common to see that. And then other immune and autoimmune conditions can develop as well. Why? Because if we go back to that matrix, the functional medicine matrix, and we saw again, how if you don't sleep for at least 7 to 9 hours, giving yourself at least 2 hours of good quality deep sleep, it starts to put pressure on the immune system because it doesn't reset in the night. So women actually over time with chronic sleep deprivation can end up with autoimmune conditions as well. So all types, rheumatoid arthritis, Hashimoto's. So, IBS, IBD, ulcerative colitis, all kinds of different things can show up, osteoporosis. So, there's so many things that can happen. And the other side of that too is if it stays out of balance for long enough, it can start to damage DNA and you can start to get things like tumor formation, which are those female cancers and other types of cancers. So we need to get cortisol back into balance, not only to help you sleep better, but also because it can increase your risk factors for these disease processes potentially setting in. Type 2 diabetes, super common for women to get diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in midlife. Blood sugar imbalances you think is the root of it, but if you're not sleeping well and your cortisol is out of balance for long enough, that alone can actually imbalance your blood sugars. So we got to be thinking big picture here too. How do we not just help your sleep? How do we help you be preventative of disease processes? And the big answer there is to get you back into balance with your cortisol. How do we do this? It sounds so simple. We know it's not that simple, but it's something I work with women all the time. And it's lowering and balancing how we adjust to stress. This is probably the number one thing that people do come to the realization that they have to work on this the most. Many when I work with, they adjust their diet. They find that challenging at first, but they're able to get it done. Many women adjust what they're doing with exercise. Again, sometimes they find it hard at first, but they're able to get that done as well. But when it comes to this, lowering and balancing and adjusting your stress, women often find this the hardest thing to do. We know why that is. There's multiple moving parts to how we manage stress, but it's part of how we're going to get ourselves back into balance, is learn what doesn't work for us, what works for us, understand our patterns. So that's where a Dutch test can come in and help us understand, are we running on low cortisol or high cortisol? Again, either of those extremes can impact sleep, and they impact other things as well, of course, but there's different management strategies for each. So if cortisol is trending too high, when we're looking at working out, for example, we don't want to be going crazy with our workouts. We don't want to be with either extreme, but when you're on high cortisol, if you're going for intense workouts, that actually elevates cortisol. So, yoga, deep breathing strategies, calming strategies, zone 2 cardio, weightlifting, but, again, not extremes, not too heavy, because that'll elevate cortisol as well. So there's ways to exercise to calm cortisol. And then there's ways to exercise to increase cortisol. So actually women often will do well with some HIIT training. So most women do know what HIIT is, but it's high intensity interval training. If you don't know what it is, definitely YouTube it. There's going to be plenty of information on it. But 10 to 20 minutes is all you need if you're in depletion. Some women start with even 5 to 10 minutes if they're really depleted, 1 to 3 times a week, and that will stimulate cortisol production. And along with that, if you have the energy, you can definitely do some walks or some hikes, some things that, just feel good to the body to get outside and get some movement, but nothing too taxing on the system. So there is some overlap there with the types of exercise, but they actually are different strategies for high versus low cortisol to get it back into balance. I don't know if you've ever, gone for some sort of intense exercise after dinner, especially in your 40s, and then had a really hard time settling down and getting to sleep. The reason is because that intense routine, especially if you do it for a long enough period of time, like 30, 40 minutes, for example, not a short HIIT workout usually, but it will elevate your cortisol. So it won't let that cortisol come down to get you ready for bed. And the diet plays a huge role. So we did talk about how when cortisol gets high, that promotes inflammation, and if inflammation gets high, it promotes high cortisol. So what is an anti-inflammatory diet? We're avoiding those simple processed packaged sugars and other foods. simple carbohydrates, baking, all that kind of stuff. Alcohol spikes our blood sugars like crazy, and cortisol. Caffeine does the same, coffee in particular. Yeah, and then I already said that, processed packaged foods. So our dietary strategy for most women has to change. This doesn't mean extremes with calorie restriction or anything like that. It's adjusting the types of foods coming in that can help you balance cortisol. Lifestyle wise, again, there's not always an easy answer. We have to find out what's going to work for us, but we do need to figure out if we're out of balance with our work routine, our family routine, our self-care routine. Many women are out of balance with their self-care routine. They're holding up the ship for all these other things, but they're low on the self-care. So I've been there. I know how that is when you're busy and you're holding up all the balls in the air, but really important. And sometimes you need to pull back on a couple of these other things if you can, to dedicate yourself to some self-care to allow your stress levels to just come down. So do less, I often say to women, not more. And then there are some supplements that can help you with balancing cortisol. Now, the supplements that can be individualized can be based on lab testing. So a Dutch test is great for this. There's certain questionnaires that I do administer to women when I work with them one-on-one. One of them is called a stress questionnaire. It can tell us if you're trending more towards higher or lower cortisol output. And there's certain adaptogenic herbal treatments that can actually help you with modulating cortisol. It's not going to be enough alone. It has to be combined with other lifestyle strategies, but it can be helpful. For example, something like ginseng and cordyceps, they're stimulating, so they can be used for low cortisol, whereas ashwagandha, rhodiola, magnolia, those can be used, L-theanine, those can be used to calm cortisol if it's too high. So you don't want to just bring in anything that says it's good for cortisol. You want to be understanding if you're running on the higher or lower side of cortisol, especially if you're trying to work on something to help you balance that bell curve throughout the day to help you sleep better. For most women, high or low cortisol, meditation, yoga, and relaxation, you're not going to go wrong there. Those are both great ways to help you balance cortisol, whether you're too high or too low. So to individualize a plan for you, you can see how much cortisol, hopefully you can see by now, how much cortisol can impact your sleep. So really important for us to understand, if we want to customize this, we need to run labs. So you can check your cortisol levels in various different ways. You can check on a simple blood test. Usually if you do that, it'll be called an AM cortisol. So it'll be checked upon waking, usually before 9 at the latest in the morning. And that'll tell you if you're low or high upon rising. You can also do a cortisol saliva test. That is a little more accurate because it checks your cortisol throughout the day, as does a urine test, which is done on a Dutch test, and it also checks your sex hormone levels. So those are going to be checking for that bell curve. Are you rising and falling with cortisol the way that you should? That actually helps you to get a good night's sleep. And then again, we can also, if you do work with me one-on-one, especially, sometimes I have this offered in group programs as well. But I will administer questionnaires to have an understanding of how you answer that. Are you looking to trend towards more high or low cortisol? Hopefully you might have a bit of an idea from what I've described here with the symptoms of high and the symptoms of low cortisol, where you might be. Sometimes it's difficult for women with these questionnaires, though. You can answer the questions in a way that you're actually looking like you're a bit of both. And that's where we rely on lab testing to give us a really clear picture. So if you want help with understanding how to individualize this, if you've been struggling with sleep for a long, long time, if it's impacting your quality of life to the point that you can't get out of bed, function, have good relationships at home, at work. A lot of women tell me they just feel like their life is just, completely out of balance. Nothing's working because they're just so out of balance with their sleep. There's definitely women I work with that have to completely go off work because they're not sleeping well. They say it's just absolutely destroying their life, their quality of life, their ability to have any enjoyment. So if you're at that point, I would not rely on guessing or even questionnaires to understand where you might be at cortisol. I wouldn't rely on, an adaptogen that says it can help with sleep, or a different supplement that says it'll help you with sleep when you're at the grocery store or what have you. I would make sure that you're actually getting some customized lab testing here to understand exactly where you're at. I do like the Dutch test the best for this because it looks at where you're at with your hormone levels. It also looks at where you're at with your adrenal hormones, and it helps to understand where the balance is between the two. So you can start to understand, is the root cause primarily related to my adrenals and my cortisol, or are my hormone levels in a hormone imbalance playing a role as well. The way a hormone imbalance usually plays a role is if you notice your sleep gets much more disrupted right before your period or right around ovulation, those key times of month where the hormones are fluctuating the most. Once you're in menopause, it's a little bit harder to check, of course, but you can definitely still check cortisol, and you can still check hormones, but you're not going to have those fluctuations as much as you do when you're in perimenopause. And I did want to let you know here that, again, depending on, you can do this on your own by understanding if you're running on high or low cortisol based on what you've gone through here in the webinar that I've shown you. I do tend to prefer that people at least fill out questionnaires. If not that, they move to the next level, which is running labs for us to understand where you're at with cortisol, to help you understand potential supplements. But these are things that can help more generally. So some of the supplements here in these links, what the top one is for if you're in the US, the bottom one's if you're in Canada. Some of them are definitely based more broadly on things like balancing blood sugars, balancing inflammation. So omega-3s, for example, can be used. They're not as specific to the high and low cortisol. So feel free to have a look. You can take a screenshot and then you can enter it, of course, in as a URL. Up to you. But there is a couple links there if you want to have a look at them. So thank you so much for being part of this webinar. Thank you to anyone who was able to come live. If there is any questions, you can either pose them in the chat or feel free actually to come off from behind the scenes and just ask away if you like. That's an option as well. But thanks to everyone who was able to attend. If you have questions, please feel free to reach out to me. I'll make sure that I post this up for you in the groups. So Facebook group for sure. I'll post it on my YouTube channel as well, Angela Simpson Functional Medicine. And again, if you have questions, you can also DM me anytime. There is a place for you to book a complimentary consultation if you look at my website too, www.angelasimpsonfunctionalmedicine.ca. And that is a place where we can have a chat, talk about your health symptoms, talk about your sleep concerns, and talk about how to get to the root cause for you to develop an individualized plan. All right. Thank you so much. Bye for now.